Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our guest today is Emily Urquhart. She's a journalist with a doctorate in folklore, and her award-winning work has appeared in Longreads, Guernica, and the Walrus, and elsewhere. And her first book was shortlisted for the Kobo First Book Prize and the BC National Award for Canadian Nonfiction. Her most recent book, The Age of Creativity, Art, Memory, My Father and Me, was listed as a top book of 2020 by CDC, Now Magazine, and Quill Quire. She's a nonfiction editor for the New Quarterly and lives in Kitchener, Ontario. Her new book, Ordinary Wonder Tales, published by Biblioasis, explores the truths that underlie the stories we imagine and reveals the magic in the everyday. Wonder Tales is the Irish term for fairy tales. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you started your career as a journalist, and then you pivoted and decided to seriously study folklore, which sounds amazing. How would you describe the study of folklore as a social science to our listeners, and what drew you to that field of study?
Well, it's funny because journalism and folklore seem at odds. Folklore, we often use it synonymously with fiction. And of course, journalism at its very best and what it strives to be is fact. But what I really wanted to do was sit with a story for longer than the few minutes or hours or days that I was able to in my journalism work. I was working at Chatelaine at the time, and I had a job as I can't remember the title. It's something like assistant editor, but that's not really what I did. I did a lot of fact checking and I wrote a lot of short health stories. So I started looking into ways that I loved journalism. I loved the kind of storytelling where you sit down with another person and you talk to them and you ask them questions about their life. And so the folklore program was something that I knew about because my mother, who is also a writer, Jane Urquhart, she owned a home in St. John's, Newfoundland, and she ended up there because she had been writer in residence many years before. So I was familiar with Memorial and had an idea about the folklore department. I've always had an interest in folklore and fairy tale. So I looked into it and I realized that I could, as a graduate student, find those kinds of longer stories. So for a thesis that you can go and sit with someone and ask them stories, and in particular, stories that talked about magic. For my master's, I did actually look at craft, which is, I think, a great example of how folklore really permeates every aspect of our lives. So as a study, it is not just fairy tales and ballads, but it's also looking at rumor and neighborly relations is something that I looked into quite a lot in my PhD. It's also material culture, so the way you might arrange your knickknacks on a mantle. That's a form of expression, and basically that's what folklore is. It's a various forms of expression, whether it comes through music or song or craft, or telling family stories. And all of this appealed greatly to me. I'm not sure I understood it entirely at that point when I was sort of applying and hoping to go to St. John's and study folklore for what I thought was going to be maybe a year and a half. And 6 years later, I was still there, and I got married, I had a baby, I was in the midst of a PhD. It was a brilliant, wonderful time of my life, and studying folklore, I would recommend to just about anyone, because folklore is all aspects of our life. There's just nothing, you're always going to find something that interests you and that pertains to you and your background and your own culture.
Folklore exists in every culture, and some say it's an important part of culture. Why do you think folklore has such a strong appeal for human beings?
Well, I think that human beings are storytelling animals. We tend to remember items that are or information that's told in a narrative form. So I think folklore appeals to us in that way, in its most sort of base, the way we would understand it as a series of stories that have been passed down through time. And I think it has worked in many different ways to help keep people safe, used as warnings, but also as entertainment. And I guess that it just, we've been telling our stories for far longer than we've ever been writing them down. So I think we continue to do that today. You know, we watch TV shows and we read whatever, even social media is a form of folklore. So I think it persists. And the other thing about folklore is that people often associate it with history, but and it can be for sure there, where let's say you're collecting oral histories from a family member, but it's actually living. It's living history. It's living heritage. It's something that persists and is very much alive and fluid and constantly changing. And so it has these really deep roots, but it's also something that we engage with every day. And I think that's its real power.
I love the idea that social media is a form of folklore, but that sounds like a rabbit hole for another time. So, so how has the study of folklore shaped or impacted your writing or how you see the world yourself?
I've had it really greatly impact both the way I see the world and the way I write. And I've thought about this a lot. And I don't want this to sound too precious, but I didn't grow up with any particular religion. Neither one of my parents had a religion that they followed, and I wasn't baptized. And that was actually kind of unusual at least in the region where I grew up. And I lived in a largely Mennonite town, actually. So people were very religious and they followed these cultural norms and that had to do with their belief systems, which is something that, of course, every family has a belief system, whether or not they ascribe to an organized religion. But I didn't have that feeling of belonging to that sort of greater belief system. And so finding folklore and really studying it right down to its elemental bits and pieces and recognizing in these ancient stories parts of my own life and my own experience. So understanding that it's been around forever and yet I can relate to it. It kind of helped me form a larger worldview. And at the same time, when you start to engage in interviews with people in folklore, you have to accept their beliefs. You can't, there have been cases for me where sometimes the beliefs where it goes against a human right. And I just can't, I'll never be able to understand that fully. But for the most part, when you approach someone and let's say you're asking someone about their belief in fairies, there's a lot of fairy belief and stories in Newfoundland. You can't approach that interview immediately assuming, well, that's not true. That's just made up stuff. When this person you're speaking to believes it, you have to just suspend that. And you just, if they believe it, then it's true to them. And therefore you treat it that way. And I think that was a big lesson for me about belief and about approaching other people's beliefs. And so it definitely changed my worldview. And I think it made me more of an empathetic human being, really. And then, of course, it just winds its way into my writing and my understanding of how to put a story together.
In the first essay of your book, The Matter, it explores a haunting that you experienced in the house you stayed in as a child. And when you stayed there as an adult, you didn't experience it, but you learned more about other children who did. So how do you understand that kind of shared paranormal experience as a folklorist and also as a person who lived through one, speaking of sharing of beliefs?
So that story is it's part of my family folklore. It's part of my family's oral history. My parents told the story repeatedly over the years, to the point where I don't know if I really, like, I feel that I have those memories, but did they instill those memories from telling me the story, and whose story is it finally, about the Something's the Matter that was a paranormal experience that was happening in the bedroom where I slept in a house that we rented in France. But I had known over the years, I knew that there were other children who had slept in that room who had experienced it as well. And once I started to write about it, my journalist curiosity took over, and I felt the need to get in touch with the people that I could find who had the same experience. And one person in particular who is around the same age as me, he had lived there the year before, and he had described it very, very closely to the way that it happened to me. But he wasn't it wasn't something he thought about. I don't think his parents turned it into their, their oral history that they retold and felt comfortable with. And I began to realize that actually asking, I'm comfortable with it because we talked about it all the time, but asking this guy about his experience, and I asked him the question, did this change your life? Did it change the direction of your life in any way? And his answer was, well, no, I don't think that that would be so, I don't. He just was clearly not feeling the same way as I was. And I started to get nervous too, thinking, well, I'm not going to press this. I'm going to leave this alone now, because it had the feeling of, we both had the same childhood bully, and I was affected by it, but he either managed to move on or didn't really want to talk about it to the great extent that I did, because that's what I do in my work and my writing. I do examine and re-examine events that have happened in the past. And I can see that that's maybe unusual. So it was interesting approaching it from that angle, and then also doing the research about other experiences of hauntings, of personal hauntings, and how they tend to inspire other personal haunting stories. And that has happened to me since the book was published, and not specifically about the room that I stayed in, but people will tell me their personal haunting tales after reading that story. And which is just what the folklorist Diane Goldstein, who I quote in the story, says. Well, that's what happens. And she was right. It's played out several times now. I've heard some very interesting haunting stories.
That is amazing how people can connect over these kinds of things. So a trigger warning regarding some themes of violence in this question. The second essay relates experiences from your own life, such as being attacked and robbed in Kyiv, or scrubbing the name of a serial killer off the walls of your summer camp. It balances them with scenes of you hearing traditional folk songs with tales of the rape and murder of women sung in the ship's pub in St. John's to a rapt audience. What is the power that those kinds of stories and the ballads hold over us today? How do we relate to them?
That story, in that essay, I talked about how the ballads, the themes, and sometimes the actual plot lines of the ballads were not unlike watching Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which is largely about crimes against very vulnerable people, and the ballads are also basically about crimes against very vulnerable people. But the ballads are from, the 14th, 15th century, and SVU is something we've been watching in the 20th and 21st century. It interested me that these stories are still very powerful and effective. We're drawn to them. SVU, I think, I don't remember, I quoted this in the book, but it is something like the longest running procedural crime drama on air. And obviously we're drawn to these stories and they're popular, or else, it would have been axed a long time ago. And the ballads persist as well. I was hearing them in St. John's at Folk Night, but balladry is still, you still hear ballads on popular, even Taylor Swift is singing ballads. So that's persisted as well. And yeah, I think they're really dark stories, but they do have a level of instructional value for the vulnerable people, thinking like, well, okay, this happened to this woman, and this person was it's like that idea, like don't go into the woods, because that's where the frightening things tend to happen. We can't always follow that that advice, but we can try to dole it out, and we can try to follow it. And so for me, yes, there was an incident in Kyiv when I lived there. I was working as a journalist at an English language newspaper, and I did go home at night alone, and I was attacked, and my purse was stolen, and it was quite a scary experience. And yet it was also a universal experience, sadly, very sadly. But so there was a ballad that I heard later that I was able to kind of weave into my own experience, because it had happened before, and it would happen again, unfortunately, and again and again. And I think that's also the power of those stories, and why we're drawn to them, is because they are very realistic, and that element of danger, as well as ideas of how to keep ourselves safe, are both very powerful.
In the title essay, you talk about how fairy tales morph when they travel, but the stories stay the same, and also how your understanding of folklore changed when you did that fieldwork for your PhD in that small outport in Newfoundland. How did that fieldwork impact your understanding of what folklore is? How did that change it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So going back to that project, I moved to a small outport. There may be population 30. It depended on the season. And I wanted to look at this idea of these outsiders coming in and buying up these beautiful old fishing homes that had been left behind in the wake of the cod moratorium, where fishing families just could not survive once there was a moratorium on their fishing livelihood. People walked away from these places. They didn't sell them. And so their houses were sometimes still full of their belongings. There was one beautiful old but very tilted house in the cove where I stayed, and the kettle was still on the stove. You could see it through the window, and no one had come back, but no one had sold it either. So these were pretty sad stories, and people coming from other provinces and other countries were discovering that you could buy one of these beautiful old fishing homes for, the advance on your credit card. They were quite cheap at the time. I don't think they're as cheap now. So there was getting to be quite an interesting sort of summer community of outsiders, which Newfoundland had not seen, not in this way. There's always been a lot of movement on that island of people, and certainly people from elsewhere. But in this case, they were coming and staying for the summers. And I really was looking at it from a journalist perspective. But once I really lived and settled, I had done all this folklore research, and I started to see these patterns that corresponded to the plot lines and the plot movements in traditional folk tales. So, there's a hero tale, for example, where the hero leaves home and then they go to find something. They're trying to achieve some kind of goal, and the goal would be the outsider trying to find a house to buy. But often there was always like a little twist of fate, a little bit of magic that led them to that house. And these stories, I was just collecting them. I wasn't looking for the patterns. It was only after I started talking to, I think I talked to, I can't remember, 30 or 40 people, and that's when I started noticing that there were these patterns that were very common to folktales. There were special roles. There was a villain role. Generally, the villain shows up and at the last minute tells them, "No, you can't buy this house after all, unless you go through these 3 different, struggles that you must overcome. And I'm going to set these tasks for you and see if you can manage to get past it." And then when they do, they win the house. The houses were always somehow won through something about being wise, something about understanding a trick, and also just winning over the neighbor who is, or whoever it is who is in the villain role. And that person would morph into a helper. And they would be the person to help the summer people, pick them up at the airport. Often it would be like a financial role. So they would pay the local person to help them keep, everything up to snuff in the winter, and check on it and turn everything on, the water back on for the summer. And it was just interesting to me. And I ultimately understood that if you live in a small place like that, you can be a villain to outsiders, but you really can't to your neighbors, because you're going to have to rely on them in some way or another. Anyhow, that's kind of a long answer, but yeah, the tale rolls from traditional folk tales, as well as the plot points, really overlaid nicely onto the stories I was collecting. So it took on a far more kind of magical angle than I had ever anticipated, with my kind of journalist brain looking into what happens when outsiders come into small outports. How does that change? Folklore won over, I guess you could say.
That's awesome. In the final essay, you talk about how your father's dementia appeared to be like a type of fairy tale, where he slipped into the other world. It's almost like classical literature as well, right? Persephone in the underworld. How do you also talk about how time is magic? It speeds up, it slows down, and that it's a story we tell ourselves made up of our experiences. Do you think that each of us individually is living in our own ordinary wonder tale?
That sounds like that's a nice thought. I like that idea. I think we are all living our own stories. I mean, our memory is really just stories that we tell ourselves, and these stories shift and change each time we tell them just a little bit. But that's part of who we are, and that's our identity. And then time is interesting. So the title of that essay is called Years Thought Days, which is taken from the Folklore Motif Index. And basically what that is are the granular elements of folktales. So very small, like they can be as small as boy is born, or water becomes solid. But I've been working with these motifs with my creative writing students. So I can tell you that like I was going to print it out for them, and then it turned out to be 1,200 pages long. So I could not do that. But so Years Thought Days is from the Folklore Motif Index, and that is about how 1 year in the human world might be 3 years in the fairy world. Or in the story that I cite, a Japanese fairy tale about Urashima Taro, who goes away into the underworld of the sea. And it's actually, he thinks he's there for, I can't remember, maybe 3 years, but it's been 300 years. So when he comes back, everything has changed, and everyone he knows and he loves has vanished, or at least changed to the point where none of his family is around anymore, but even his home looks different, and the trees are different. And I found a paper where gerontology scholars had likened this fairy tale to the experience of dementia and the experience of time when you have dementia. And I really related to that, because to me, it did seem that my father was existing in several points in time at the same moment. He was engaging with his granny, who was his very favorite person, his biggest supporter, but he was also having a conversation with me, maybe mistaking me for her. And so there was something about that was a bit of a comfort, because we sort of assume that there's only confusion with dementia, and that it's only upsetting. Whereas if you can look at it more of a story, and you think about people engaging in different points in their past, that actually might be bringing quite a lot of joy. So that was a helpful way to start to look at some of the harder parts of dementia, of living with a loved one with dementia.
When you were writing this book, who did you picture you were writing to as an audience? And what do you hope that they take away from the experience of reading it?
Oh, I love that question. I'm not sure I did picture who I was writing to. These stories have been kind of bouncing around, being rewritten, and arriving and leaving and coming back again over a period of many years. There are a few that I wrote after signing my book contract, but some of them go back many, many years. So it's hard to know. A lot of the work, the revision work and some of the news stories happened during the pandemic, where it kind of felt like no one would ever read it. Because I was up here in my attic. I would get up really early because of course there was homeschool to contend with. And I would come up here and write in the mornings. It was freezing. There's no heat up here. Well, I have a little heater, but and it sort of felt like I was alone in the world, and maybe I didn't really know who I was writing to because I wasn't sure. It was such a iffy time. I had signed a contract with Biblioasis, and I knew that, but it still didn't feel finite. I still felt like anything could crumble at any moment. And so I kept working, and it was real, but I wasn't actually thinking so much about an audience because I wasn't sure that there ever would be one. That sounds so sad, but that's kind of the mindset I was in at the time. But now that it's gone out into the world, I've had some really lovely responses where people are relating to aspects of it that, I hadn't even thought of. Like, as I mentioned with the personal haunting tales, a woman I know not well, but from the neighborhood had read it. And while we were waiting to pick up our kids from school playground, she told me all about this ghost that haunted her sister, but really only she thought maybe actually had a romantic interest in her sister because it was really men that was a problem that came into the apartment. That's when the ghost got really worked up. So, when I was writing this, I wasn't thinking that my neighbor, who I didn't know very well, might tell me this amazing story after reading the book. And yeah, so I guess I want people to read it and to be open to beliefs that might stray beyond what they're comfortable with, and see that there's wonder there.
So what are you working on now? Are you writing another book or an essay or something?
I'm working on a story about a large open pit limestone mine, which is beside the family cottage that we have on Lake Ontario. And I heard about peregrine falcons that were nesting there. So I went and did a visit into this enormous mine, and the idea of kind of a fable came to me. And so I'm doing a lot of research on, like botanical folklore and plant folklore, tree folklore, all of the natural world and the folklore world. And of course, those are really interwoven in general, but I'm looking specifically at the natural world that surrounds that limestone mine and seeing what folklore I can pull out of it. And that's about all I know. This is maybe another situation where I'm just by myself thinking, I don't know that anyone's ever going to read this, but I'm just going to keep going and see what happens.
You're exploring. That's great.
Yeah.
It sounds intriguing. We're looking forward to whatever it is that you bring next. Would you like to read some of your work for our audience?
Yes, I would love to. So I think what I'll do is read the first little section. It's probably about 3 minutes from the story Child Unwittingly Promised. The title is also a folklore motif. It's also pulled from the folklore motif index. And this story is written in a way with little chapters. So I'll just read the little chapter of the first one. There are 2 stories I want to tell you about a child unwittingly promised. I will begin by telling the earliest story, which takes place not in your time and not in my time, but in a time long ago and far away. The setting is an old grist mill in Castleton, Ontario, that my great-uncle owned for a period in the 1980s and 90s. The mill is 2 stories tall, with a peaked roof and a wooden sign, barely visible today, that spells out the name of the former owners across the facade. They were the Purdy family, but this story didn't happen in their time either. The mill is a stage set. It is the location my mind conjures when I read this fairy tale and also when I think about it. The mill sits alongside a stream at the foot of a small hill. There is an apple tree in the field behind it, but only in my mind's eye. 30 years ago, my mother's cousin ran an antique shop out of this mill. She was choosy about which items she would sell to people. If she felt the piece didn't suit the buyer, a teacup, a side table, a cuckoo cloth, she would tell them that it wasn't for sale. She believed each item had a rightful owner. She was more a matchmaker than salesperson. Once when I visited the shop, my mother's cousin allowed me to buy a set of dishes which I still own today. They are a soft yellow color with a sweet pastoral pattern, a thatched cottage nestled among rolling green hills, half an orange sun peeking through the fluffy clouds above. The landscape on these dishes is the backdrop for the first story of The Child Unwittingly Promised. The pattern is what you might see in the distance if you were standing and facing the old mill, which is where the story opens. The first person to appear in this story is the miller, but I do not cast my great-uncle in this role. My great-uncle was sweet and kind, while the miller is a greedy, clueless man whose features aren't altogether clear to me, a hint of a face above blue coveralls. The miller, who lives with his wife and their teenage daughter, has fallen little by little into poverty, but we don't learn why. As in most fairy tales, all that happens before the traditional opening line is meaningless. The action is immediate and linear, contained within the tale. There is no past to consider, no narrative flashbacks to give context. These details are up to the listener to fill. One afternoon, the miller decides to go to the forest to chop some wood. Perhaps he could sell some kindling, he thinks. Maybe he could sell it in bundles along the roadside, the kind you see in crates at the foot of country lanes, with painted signs alerting passers-by that there's firewood for sale. In the woods, the miller meets an old man he's never seen before. This old man says he'll buy what lies behind the mill, and in exchange, the miller will receive a lifetime of wealth. This has the ring of a get-rich-quick scam, or at the very least a pyramid scheme. But as I mentioned, the miller is greedy, and this tends to cloud his logic. The miller does a brief mental inventory of what lies behind the mill. Grass, earth, what else? Oh, there's the old apple tree. Well, he can do without apples, he thinks. He agrees to sell, and the old man hands him a pen and a contract to sign. The miller signs the form and hands it back without reading the terms and conditions, maybe because he's illiterate and he can't, or maybe because he's careless. The old man folds the contract neatly and tucks it into a pocket of his windbreaker. Back at home, which I imagine to be the thatched cottage from the yellow dishes, the miller finds his bewildered wife on the doorstep. She has come outside to escape her house, because it is brimming with gold coins from every drawer, closet, and cupboard, and she does not understand how or why, but she has a bad feeling that her husband is involved and that the money is dirty. She doesn't say this outright, but you can read between the lines when she says, "Tell me, miller, how did all this wealth suddenly get into our house?" She's obviously ready for an argument because she doesn't use his proper name, which we don't know, but surely she does. The miller is focused only on his good fortune, and he shrugs off his wife's accusatory tone. A stranger in the forest promised me great wealth if I agreed in writing to give him what's behind our mill, he says. I envision him smiling broadly as he tells her this. I see the wife turning away from the miller when she responds, so that she's facing the rolling green hills, the puffy clouds, and the orange sun in the porcelain yellow sky. You fool. Our daughter was sweeping behind the mill, she tells her husband. You've promised her to the devil. Thanks.
Wow, that was quite remarkable. Thank you so much for joining us, Emily Urquhart.
Thank you. It's been lovely chatting with you and being here. Thanks so much.
And the book, once again, is Ordinary Wonder Tales, published by Biblioasis. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.